Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, founder of the Sports History Network and also known around these parts as the Football History Dude. Now, before we get into this episode, I just want to give you a huge thank you for all of the support that you've given the Sports History Network over the years. And as we close out this year, I just want to wish you happy holidays. And you're going to hear from other members of the network here at the end of this episode, so stay tuned. And speaking of these other members, well, let's jump right into another episode presented by the Sports History Network.
Another episode of the Professional Football Researchers Association podcast. Jon Bozeka along with you, George Bozeka with you as well, as we have done a number of these now. And we've taken some time off. We've enjoyed some holiday fun. We've enjoyed the football season in terms of high school and college to this point. And obviously the pros, about 12, 13 weeks into the year now. Seems like it goes faster and faster every year. But wanted to get back to doing a couple podcasts and going to have a topic tonight that is based all around a famous coach, and that is Coach George Allen, who had so many great years as a professional football coach with the Rams, with Washington, had cups of coffee a number of places, and was very successful, maybe mostly known for what he did in Chicago at one point as well. So truly a special man in the world of football. And we're going to have two different people join us over the course of the night. But first one that's going to join us is Lee Elder. He is the executive director of the Professional Football Researchers Association, former journalist, and he has written 25 books, he told us, which is a pretty high number, more than the man sitting next to me, George. He's still in the JV level at this point, working to try to get one under his belt. So he's edited a number of them. Lee, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So the book about George Allen and the topic of George Allen, what drew you to wanting to write a book about him? It's called Coach George Allen, A Football Life, and we're holding a copy right now and showing it to you. And obviously it's a beautiful book, and I've not had the chance to read it. I leafed through it a little bit earlier tonight, but what drew you to him initially, Lee?
Well, there were two things. One of the people that I quote in the book who played for Allen at Whittier College, Max Fields, is a good friend of mine, and Max has been after me for a long time to write a book about Allen. And that seed was in my mind for maybe 20 years or so. And then after my book about the Civil War, That Bloody Hill, Hilliard's Legion at Chickamauga, was published by McFarland, they said to me, now you should write a football book. And I said, the only idea I've got is George Allen, and that's how it got started. And I sat next to my dad for many years at a lot of Rams games in the LA Coliseum in the 60s. And I knew that as I wrote this book, I was going to be thinking about Dad, and we had just lost him a year or so before we started on this project. So all those things came together and made this something I just had to do.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously a man, too, that does have an emotional connection for you, as you mentioned there. You saw the Rams play when he was on the sideline. You have an emotional connection there. Did that make it easier for you to write this and easier to approach this topic?
At first it did. There was a 3.5-month period where I had to put the book aside and couldn't even look at it. I was writing about the 68 season. My dad and I went to every game in 68 and 69, every home game. Yeah. And when I got to certain parts of the 68 season, it got to be too much. I had to put it away for a little while. So it was easy because I loved the story and I knew the story and I was comfortable telling the story. It was difficult because I had to start thinking about the fact that not too long earlier I had lost Dad. So there was a lot of going on there. But what I did was finally I just skipped 68, 69, and 70 and wrote the entire Redskins period. That got my momentum back, and then I finished up the Rams section.
Lee, one of the things we want to do is we want to talk to you mainly about his years with the Rams. We'll later have Mike Richman on, and we're going to sort of focus with him on the Redskins because he's obviously also written a number of books on the Redskins, but we feel that you're tied to the Rams years. And if you could explain a little bit Coach Allen's genesis into the NFL.
Well, George Allen was a head coach at Whittier College in the 50s. Whittier is in Southern California. And during the time that Allen was coaching at Whittier, in the summers, he would volunteer his time with the Rams preseason camp, which is at Redlands University, which is in another part of Southern California. So the Rams knew him, and they hired him to be the wide receivers coach in 1957. And then after 57, Sid Gilman, who was the head coach, fired half his staff, including Allen. So that was the first time the Rams fired him. Altogether, they fired him 4 times. But he returned to the Rams in 1966 as the head coach after having a very successful time with the Chicago Bears in the early 60s. The Bears won the 63 championship, as both of you guys know, and the football players on the team handed Allen the game ball. Instead of giving it to George Halas, who was the head coach, they gave it to George Allen because he had done so much to prepare them for playing the Giants. So when he moved to the Rams in 66, the Rams were a franchise that was terrible. They had gone from the championship game in 55 to nothing all the way through 65. They were not a competitive team, really. In 1966, Allen made them winners. In 67, he got them the Coastal Division Championship. They won again in 68. They did not get to the playoffs, but they were a winning team. In 69, they started off 11-0, made it to the playoffs. And then in 70, they didn't. So the Rams were a bungling, fumbling franchise until Allen took over, and then they were winners.
And twice during that span with the Rams, and you mentioned it earlier, twice during that span, he was fired. He was fired once by owner Dan Reeves, and then he was fired again by owner Dan Reeves. And my understanding from the book and everything else is the first time he was fired by Dan Reeves after a couple seasons, the players, the community, basically people rallied around him because they didn't want him to go.
Yeah, a lot of the players revolted. They said that they simply weren't going to play football in 1968 if Allen was not rehired. Roman Gabriel was among them. Gabriel said it was kind of a funny line. He said the Roman Gabriel travel agency is just about to get a new employee, meaning he was going to go to work for his travel agency because he wasn't going to be playing quarterback. Deacon Jones was another one who was vociferous in his support of Allen. So the players who had done so much losing without him wanted him back because they wanted to keep winning. Another thing that happened in 68 that sort of brought it all to a head was the Rams played a game in Kezar Stadium in San Francisco, which you guys probably remember is just not a real fun place to play football.
No.
And Allen was sharply critical of the 49ers groundskeepers and of the condition that the field was in. The end zone particularly was in just terrible shape. So Reeves was unhappy about that, and in the following week he said that the Rams shouldn't make excuses. They lost the game, and he would not support protesting the condition of the field to the league and all those sort of things. So basically, in public, he told his coach not to complain about things, and the team didn't like that. Allen didn't like that. So the following week, after the Rams won a game against New York in Los Angeles, Reeves came into the locker room, and Allen wouldn't talk to him. And I don't think that helped Allen's cause because at the end of the season he was gone. But I think the combination of Allen being rude to Reeves in front of reporters in the locker room, Reeves shooting down Allen in public after the game in San Francisco, and the fact that Reeves liked to fire coaches every 3 years anyway, I think that sort of played against George Allen in 1968.
Yeah, that was sort of Reeves' history. I know when we researched the 51 Rams book, he could be he could be quick to pull the trigger. It's funny. You mentioned Kezar Stadium. I think of Kezar Stadium. I think of the 49ers, but I also think of the movie Dirty Harry, because there's a famous scene in the movie Dirty Harry that they filmed in Kezar Stadium. And if you've seen the movie, I think you know what scene I'm talking about. So whenever I hear Kezar, I automatically think of Clint Eastwood. I don't know why, but I should think about the Niners.
It's not the first time someone got shot down in Kezar Stadium.
Lee, I was looking in. Lee Elder is our guest, executive director of the Professional Football Researchers Association on the PFRA podcast here through the Sports History Network. I was looking up stuff about George Allen while you and George were talking here, and one of the things that struck me, that I think I knew this, but it's back in the back of my mind with a bunch of other football history, is just the guys that coached under him too. Howard Schnellenberger and Ted Marchibroda, and he really, this guy has quite a football tree with him too, and that's all part of the Hallis tree too, isn't it?
Well, some of it is, yeah, but not all of it. Dick Vermeil was the first special teams coach in NFL history, and he wasn't a George Hallis guy. Allen just hired him. He only coached with Allen for 1 year, but he still talks about the impact that Allen had on his career. And of course, he's in the Hall of Fame. And the next special teams coach he hired was Marv Levy, who is in the Hall of Fame. So the Allen coaching tree is quite significant. He got Howard Schnellenberger from Bear Bryant at Alabama. And one of the reasons was he knew that Bryant was really, really good with his kicking game, and he knew that Schnellenberger would bring that with him. And I think that in some way impacted the decision to get himself an extra assistant coach. There's a great story in the book about Schnellenberger and his first contract with the Rams. I'm not going to tell you the story. I want everybody to buy the book, but it's a funny story.
Allen obviously never had a losing season with the Rams. In fact, he never had a losing season in any of the years that he was a head coach in the NFL. One of the sort of the theses of your book is, why was he so successful? Why was he a winner? Can you elaborate on what some of your conclusions were as to why Allen was such a successful winning coach in the NFL?
Yeah, there were a few reasons, but I think the biggest thing that nobody really understands about Allen was he was a tremendous judge of talent. And he could look at somebody playing for a different team in a different system, watch that player go, and he could project how that player would work in the George Allen system. He got players like Maxie Bond for that reason. He could see the way that Bond played for the Eagles, project the way he would play in Allen's system, and know that he would be a good player. That's something that Allen had that I think is not talked much about. Remember George Allen, when he was with the Bears, he's the guy who drafted Gale Sayers and then Dick Butkus. And Gale Sayers was not the first halfback selected in that draft. There were two running backs selected before Sayers. So when people say, well, anybody could have drafted Gale Sayers, yeah, anybody could have, but two people didn't. And nobody in the AFL drafted Dick Butkus in the first round. So Allen had a great ability to judge talent. And when he went to Washington, I know Mike's going to talk about the Washington years, but he took with him a lot of those talented guys because he wanted his system and he knew that he could salt and pepper them in with the good players that Washington had. I'll let Mike talk about that, but Allen's ability to judge talent was, I think, very significant. The other thing was George Allen believed in the kicking game. And I say in the book that the two most impactful plays in his coaching career were a blocked punt against the Green Bay Packers and a blocked field goal in the Super Bowl against the Miami Dolphins. His ability to make special teams important changed pro football.
And that's interesting that you bring that up about special teams and how he was the first one to hire a special teams coordinator. His impact on the game, do you think we'll ever fully realize what that is then, and just the effect that it's had since the 60s to now? I mean, even before that, but just his impact for being the first to hire that. That's a staple on an NFL team now, isn't it? I mean, what kind of impact do you think we'll look at this guy as having 100 years from now?
Well, I think when we get further and further away from anybody, no matter who it is, whether they're the president of the United States or somebody like that, we lose a sense of the impact that they had. But I think that Allen's biggest contribution was his belief in the kicking game, his expansion of his coaching staff to include that. And he had to convince Dan Reeves, who had just fired him, to hire a new coach. He had just gotten rehired, and now he wants to make it more expensive to have him. But he was able to convince Reeves that having a special teams coach would be very important. And we all know that it was. If you follow the game now, as you guys were saying, special teams are a very, very important part. And the special teams coordinator now, I think, has assistants on most NFL's coaching staffs.
Do you think part of the reason for the friction between him and Reeves was that Reeves was a very hands-on owner, and Allen had a reputation for being a very hands-on, controlling coach that basically wanted to control, everything, including, the direction of the sun. I think there was a famous story about him wanting to know where the direction of the sun was, which you might be able to elaborate on. But do you think that was the reason for part of the friction between the two?
I think so, but I think also Allen was a free spender because it wasn't his money. And that bothered Edward Bennett Williams, of the Redskins, too. I think that didn't help Allen much in his relationship with Dan Reeves because, Allen was spending Reeves' money and basically saying he wanted the final decision. Reeves wanted the final decision on how his money was being spent, and that was part of the reason for the friction. And you were talking about the angle of the sun. That was for the Super Bowl game against Miami in the LA Coliseum, a place where he had coached for all those years, and he still wants somebody to go scout the position of the sun at kickoff time. You would think that Allen would have already known that.
You call him in the book, if I'm not mistaken, the first modern NFL coach. Why do you call him that?
Well, he worked more hours than other coaches did. He expanded his coaching staff to include a special teams coach, which had never happened before. And his approach to breaking down the schemes, both offensive and defensive and special teams, of opposing coaches was much more complete than other coaches were doing at that time. And that's not me saying that. That's Dick Vermeil saying that.
Didn't his wife once call the police because he wasn't home and she was wondering where he was?
When he was coaching at Morningside, and then later when he was coaching at Whittier, it'd be 2-3 in the morning, and she'd be sort of wondering exactly where her husband was. So she would call the police, ask them to go to the coach's offices at the university and just make sure her husband was okay.
One of the guys that played for him, and I guess I want to maybe get your opinion on this because I think he's a guy that's in the PFRA Hall of Very Good, Roman Gabriel. And I want to get your opinion on that and maybe if there's anything that you could share that George Allen would have said about him. I mean, do you think this is the guy that deserves to be in the Hall of Fame after doing research about George Allen, about him, about those Rams teams?
I do, and part of the reason that I feel that way about Gabriel is not just the time that he spent with the Rams. At the end of his career, he was with Philadelphia, and I think he was comeback player of the year when he was playing for the Eagles. He had some good years with Philadelphia there at the end of his career, and those were not good Eagles teams, not when he got there. They got a little bit better, but Gabriel, I feel, is one of those guys that should be in the Hall of Fame, despite the fact that he didn't win a championship. We tend to put quarterbacks in there if they win a championship, and we tend to hold it against them if they didn't. But Roman Gabriel is one of those guys that I feel was and is deserving of being there. He was a dominant player during his career.
When it comes to a guy like a George Allen, and I know I asked about this earlier, but in researching and reading about him and learning more about him, where have you seen his impact on future coaches? Lee, have you found that? Have you seen that there are coaches that are, in maybe other sports even, or maybe in the game of football, that have been able to say, hey, if not for George Allen, I might not have been in the position that I'm in as a head coach?
I haven't seen it, although, you have Dick Vermeil, you have Marv Levy. They both talked about their time with Allen. You have coaches come in and coaches go out, and you don't know what system they would have used and things like that. But where I found Allen's influence is in his former players and the way that they talk about him. There's a guy named Mike Hull who played fullback, and he was going to be out of football. Allen brought him in to try out with the Redskins, and he ended up being with the Redskins for 5 seasons. And Hull talked about the impact that Allen had on him. My friend Max Fields, who played for George 1 year at Whittier College, will still tell you today about the impact that Allen had on him, not only as a football player, but also later on when Max was a coach. The George Allen impact on him was quite obvious also. He talked about the organization of practices and things like that. The players that played for him later in life thought about him quite a bit and had a very high opinion of him. And so if you don't look at the coaches so much as you look at his impact on the players, it becomes more obvious.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that Lee Elder, our guest, by the way, author of George Allen, Coach George Allen, A Football Life, as well as a number of other books. And it's a great book if you've not seen it. On the front, it has a picture of him as the Washington head coach from 1971. It's a beautiful addition to your library if you're looking for a book to add for Christmas. As Lee Elder, Executive Director of Professional Football Researchers Association, our guest. Last thing I want to ask, and then I don't know what else George has for you, but last thing I wanted to ask, you mentioned some of those like organizational things, some of the things that the players mentioned. You mentioned your friend too, and I guess I want to ask from a standpoint of those things in a practice, of those things during a week, what are some of those things that they've told you about that he used to do that made him unique, that made him different at a time where other coaches weren't doing those things?
He did a lot of team building, but he did it in unique ways. He had barbecues in the park for some of his college players. He had during the years that he coached in college. He did things to sort of build up camaraderie. And I think Mike will probably tell you about this. He broke his hand giving a karate demonstration in the locker room one time when he was with Washington. And with the Rams, he did other things to build camaraderie. And he understood what that meant. He brought in Bill George, who was a longtime veteran linebacker. He was at the end of his career, but in 1966, Allen brought him in to play for the Rams so that the Rams players who had not done any winning could see how a champion prepared to play football. And Allen understood team chemistry about as well as it can be understood, and he was very dedicated to making sure he had the kind of chemistry that he wanted in the team. And that was something that is unique. Allen didn't yell at his players. He talked to them, but he did not yell. He made them work hard. He gave them long practices and worked them until they would, about ready to fall down, but he did not yell. He was a talker, not a yeller. And some of the players I've talked to who later coached said that they coached the same way because that was a way to get buy-in. The guy isn't yelling at me. He's talking to me. He's coaching me, not yelling at me. And that gave him buy-in, which creates team chemistry.
I have 2 other things I want to ask you about, Lee. One is, for as great a coach he was also known for his eccentricities. I know one that I can come to mind is that he always tried to eat soft food because it didn't take up as much of his time, which I think is sort of humorous. And I know he had an affinity for ice cream. But can you go into some of those eccentricities? Because I always remember during that time frame watching the games and how they would sometimes, refer to him as a great coach, but, also, had some, some unusual, things about him. Can you go into that?
Well, he was a unique individual. Let's agree on that. Along with being a tremendous football coach. One of the guys that played for him at Whittier told me that that Allen would say, okay, the other team has a 1st and goal at our 3-yard line. Now we have the advantage. And, that sounds a little odd, but by the time he was done explaining his point to them, there was less ground to defend. They had to come right at you. You know what you're going to do defensively. You don't have to think about it. You just have to go play it. That may sound a little eccentric, but he was right about it. So there are other things that I heard like that kind of made you think, okay, that's a little odd, but doggone it, it worked. So I guess another thing we've talked about, when he had somebody go check the angle of the sun in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum prior to the Super Bowl game. Yeah, George probably should have known where the sun was going to be. He coached there, for all those years. But it was a different month than he'd ever coached there. He wants to see exactly where it's going to be, because that's going to change if you get the coin flip a certain way, what angle you want, which zone do you want to protect and all that kind of thing. So he did have some eccentricities. He preferred not to chew. He preferred to eat, drink his food, milkshakes or whatever else he could do, simply because it would take so much more time to have to chew something. He was all about getting back to his scouting and doing all that kind of stuff. But you can't say it didn't work. He was at one time, he was the head of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, because he understood physical fitness, and he was a very healthy individual all his life. So you'd have to say that that may sound a little eccentric, but it kept him healthy for a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I did know that. And actually, I was going to get into some of his presidential relationships, since we're going to be talking about the nation's capital with Mike Richman. I was going to get into some of those relationships he had with some of the presidents. Last question that I wanted to ask, unless John has anything else, is we've already mentioned the first 3 times he was fired by the Rams. He was fired a 4th time. After his tenure with the Redskins, he was rehired, and it was sort of a shock at the time. He was rehired by then Rams owner Carroll Rosenblum, and things didn't work out so well. Can you go into that?
Yeah, things didn't work out so well, and the reason is that George Allen had always gone to a team that was losing. Why else do you fire your coach? You don't fire a winning coach, you fire a losing coach. But the Rams had allowed Chuck Knox to leave after a very successful tenure in Los Angeles, and they brought in Allen, but they didn't allow Allen to be the general manager. Don Klosterman was a general manager of the Rams at that point, and he was a very good one. So they brought him in and said, all you do is coach. And after 2 preseason games, the players were unhappy with the way Allen was doing things. He was different from Chuck Knox, and they were unhappy that Knox was gone in the first place. So they could have brought in just about anybody, and he would have been unpopular with the players. So after 2 preseason games, Rosenblum fired him and paid him every penny that he was supposed to get paid for his contract, but he fired him. And in the book, I make an interesting point, at least I thought it was interesting. Years later, Rosenblum's widow, Georgia Frontiere, became owner of the Rams, and she hired a coach named Dick Vermeil. And Vermeil had some players grumbling because he made them practice a long time, he made them work hard, he made them run, did all the things that you have to do to build a team up. And the players were unhappy about it. Georgia Frontiere stood behind Dick Vermeil, who then won a Super Bowl.
And it's interesting too. It's interesting too, because after they got rid of, well, go ahead, and then I'll ask this aside.
Well, I was just going to say that it's the difference in owners. If the Rams hold on to Allen, if they make a point that he's the coach, if the players have to follow everything that he's got, George has now got a winner. Proven winner, and he's got some good football players on that team, Isaiah Robertson and Vince Ferragamo and Pat Hayden, and a great football team and a great defense. Knox had built a great defense. It would have been interesting to see what that Rams team could have done. It's one of the great what-ifs of the George Allen story.
Well, and it's interesting, too, and that's what I was going to allude to, is I believe they brought in Malavasi then as the coach, and he got him to the Super Bowl in 2 years and lost to the Steelers and Terry Bradshaw and that great Steelers team. But then the thing about Malavasi was I always had heard, even though Allen was also a bit of a player's coach. Malavasi was, obviously not the disciplinarian, but Malavasi really didn't have that staying power and that success over an extended period of time that Allen did. He did get him to the Super Bowl, which I'm sure was a moment of celebration in Los Angeles, but he didn't have that staying power that Allen did in terms of winning.
Well, he was a very good football coach. He was on Allen's staff. They didn't bring him in. He was on Allen's staff. He just got promoted to head guy. But, I mean, Ray Malavasi was a good football coach. But, as you say, he didn't have Allen's staying power, and he didn't last, much longer beyond the Super Bowl. I still think one of the great what-ifs is what if they had left Allen in charge of that Rams team and given him a little bit more say about building the roster, made him maybe a semi part of the general manager tree. And I think that would have been an interesting football team.
I think it is, and I think you kind of brought this up, Lee, but I think it is unique that eventually when the Rams did finally win their Super Bowl in 1999, that Dick Vermeil was the guy who was on the sideline for them eventually in 1999, kind of the full circle and, kind of almost Allen working in mysterious ways there, kind of getting it done in a different, unique way. I'm sure that's something Coach Vermeil thought about when they finally hoisted the Lombardi all those years later. Lee, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it very much.
Lee, if people want to get the book as a Christmas present or just to get it to add to their library, where can they purchase the book?
Well, they can go to the McFarland website, mcfarland.com. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. And just look up football books, and it'll be right there. Coach George Allen, A Football Life. It's 5 years of my life, too, so I guess you could add that on to George's life, and there you go. It was a great thing, a great deal of fun to go through that research, and it's been a lot of fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, Lee, I did want to give you one last chance here. I know that in the acknowledgments and right before it that you do have a word about your dad. Just the importance the book has for you because of that and because of the connection that you and your dad had around the Rams and around the teams that George Allen coached. Maybe George Allen will never know that, probably never would, but that connection that you built because of it. Tell us about that a little bit.
In 1968, there's a very famous game where the Rams lost a down due to an officiating error. It was against the Bears, second to last game of the season. And as we're walking out of the Coliseum, I've got my transistor radio, and Dick Enberg said, it's been confirmed the Rams should have gotten one more down. And my dad said, I thought so. I thought they made a mistake. As I was writing this book, I kept thinking about that moment. And when I had to write about the 68 season, I got closer and closer to that. And that's when I stopped for a little while, like I told you about. Thank you for bringing that up. Dad liked George Allen, and obviously as a boy, I loved sitting next to Dad at the Coliseum. It was a great thing. And I have to say, too, that my mother and my sister never complained when we took off to go to a ball game. So it was sort of a family thing.
It's always great to hear that. That's similar to the relationship I have with this guy next to me, too. So it's cool to hear that. So I appreciate you joining us, Lee. Lee Elder, the Executive Director of the Professional Football Researchers Association. Thanks for joining the podcast, Lee.
Thanks for having me, and I hope you have a good talk with Mike.
Our episode revolving around George Allen continues on the Professional Football Researchers Association podcast. Just heard from Lee Elder, who is, of course, the author of Coach George Allen, A Football Life. And we thanked him for joining us. And now we are going to be joined by author and pro football historian and Mike Richman to talk about his book, George Allen, A Football Life. No coach in front of it this time, just George Allen, and it's a thicker book and has a lot more heft to it. And I like the color scheme that he chose as well, because it's clearly reflective of Mike's favorite team, I'm guessing, the now Washington Commanders. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me on. This is going to be great.
Absolutely. So, Mike, I asked Lee the same question earlier, and I like doing this whenever I talk the same topic about somebody, but what drew you to Coach Allen? Was it the fandom that you have for Washington? Was it the coaching style? What drew you to wanting to write a book about the great Coach George Allen?
Well, the fandom was part of it. It was a major part. I mean, I've been part of the Redskins fanaticism over the years, and I'll refer to them as the Redskins because that's what they were known as when he coached them in the 70s. I grew up in the Washington area, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a D.C. suburb. So when Allen came here in 1971 to coach the Redskins, I was 10 years old, and I became hooked on that team. That was my team, and I would, follow them every Sunday. I'd be, running home to, if I didn't catch the entire game, I'd be running home to find out what was that score. So, I knew of George Allen, and I knew who the players were and their numbers, and my father, in a promotional event, he invited one of the Redskins players, running back Charlie Haraway, to come to his men's clothing store. So that was a great photo shoot opportunity, autographs and everything. So what I'm building to is that was really the growth of my own fanaticism in the team. And I chose, I loved to write as a kid, and I chose journalism as a career. And I wrote the Redskins Encyclopedia, which was published in 2007, and then the Washington Redskins Football Vault in 2010, and Joe Gibbs' Enduring Legacy in 2015. So in my mind, George Allen, and this I think is like the final piece to the answer to your question, George Allen was like a biography, a definitive biography on George Allen. That was like the final piece of the puzzle in my mind. With the 3 other literary projects that I had completed, I had to write something on Allen. And he was my coach when I was growing up watching the Redskins. I knew a lot about him. I wrote a bio about him in the Redskins Encyclopedia, and I touched on him quite a bit in the Redskins Vault. So, but I had to write a definitive biography on him, and that is what drove me to really undertake this project.
I want to go back in time and I only want to do this because John and I obviously are both from Northeast Ohio. I grew up in Canton. John, obviously, after I moved here, was born in Akron. But there's a Northeast Ohio tie to George Allen that was in your book. And it's an obscure thing, but it caught my eye. Chuck Mather, who was with the Bears and actually was a very ultra successful high school coach at Massillon High School here in Northeast Ohio, went 57-3 during his 6 seasons there and won 6 state championships. He was to the 50s in Massillon what Paul Brown was during the 30s. Chuck Mather played a role in George Allen getting job with the Bears. Do you remember that story from the book?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That was, George Allen was out of coaching at the time. He was let go by the Los Angeles Rams. That's the only, that's the conclusive thing that I could, the way I pinpointed how he departed the Rams after the 57 season. So he was out of coaching. He was, one thing he was doing was he was selling weighted footballs. He also sold golf clubs, but by selling weighted footballs, he was able to make his way into the training camps of several of the NFL teams, one of which was the Chicago Bears. And now that's how he met Chuck Mather. And Mather actually, he sympathized with Allen's situation. He knew of Allen's football mind in speaking with him, and the fact he knew a lot about the game at that point, having coached for nearly a decade at the college level, and then he coached in the NFL with the Rams. So Mather approached Halas about hiring George Allen, and Halas at first brought Allen in as a spy. The 58 Bears had 2 late-season regular season games against the Los Angeles Rams, who Allen knew of from the prior season. So Halas brought him in as a spy to tell the Bears secrets about the LA Rams. And then in the early months of 59, that's when Halas hired him as the Bears' head talent scout. And then later late in 62, he appointed him to replace Clark Shaughnessy as the Bears' defensive coordinator. That was like an interim role, and then he made him permanent in that role in early 1963.
So, Mike, are you telling us that coaches before Jim Harbaugh spied on other teams in football? Is that what you're telling us?
That is absolutely true, yes. It existed before Jim Harbaugh, long before. In fact, Allen, when he was the head coach in the NFL, he was known as the league's master spy. I mean, he would send his assistants out to spy on other teams and watch them in practices, particularly the Dallas Cowboys. I mean, that's where that story was most prominent. And Bob Lilly, the great Cowboys defensive tackle who I interviewed for the book, told me this story that they were so afraid of George Allen and his staff watching them in practice that they moved to an indoor facility after a while, that Cowboys team. So, yeah, Allen was really known for it. There's also this one little anecdote, a quote from Weeb Eubank in the book, that in 1972, he had the Jets practice at Rikers Island, with the major prison is on Rikers Island. So Eubank was quoted as saying, well, yeah, let's see George Allen sneak somebody in there. So,
he probably had a guy on the inside, didn't he?
Maybe he possibly could have. But the point I'm making is he had learned that initially from Halas. Halas was George Allen's top mentor, as top coaching mentor. So he picked up the good and the bad from Halas. One of the good things that he learned from him was Halas's workaholic nature. I mean, Halas was a 24/7 guy at that time. Of course, Allen took that to a new level when he became a head coach in the NFL, but he picked that up from Halas too. So he learned the good and the bad from Halas.
So jumping ahead now, George Allen has his time with the Rams. He's fired by Dan Reeves, and within a matter of days, he's contacted by Washington. Can you tell that story and what things were like in Washington? Because my understanding at the time is that, even though a couple of years ago it seemed like all the Washington teams with the Nationals and everything else were very, very competitive, this was a time when really the Senators, the Redskins, these teams were not very competitive. And they bring in George Allen. And can you explain all that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I want to mention first that Allen was fired for the first time by Reeves after the 1968 season. It was a very confusing situation. I mean, Allen had this remarkable record in his first 3 seasons coaching the Rams, but Reeves didn't like him. He was jealous, and he didn't like Allen's big spending ways because Allen had control of the active roster. He could get all these veteran players and pay them a lot of money. So Reeves fired him the first time after the 1968 season. So the point I want to get at, though, is that's when the Redskins first pursued George Allen. Edward Bennett Williams knew him, that he had met Allen at a 1966 owners meeting, and Allen happened to be in attendance. He liked him there. And also Jack Kent Cooke, owner of the Los Angeles Lakers and Los Angeles Kings, he came to know Allen, and they actually became friends. And so both Williams and Cook influenced Allen to come to Washington at that point. After the 1968 season, Allen said, no, I'm going to fulfill my 5-year contract. I'm probably going to get fired again. But so he stayed with L.A., and sure enough, he did get fired after the 1970 season for the second time by Reeves. So Edward Bennett Williams and Jack Kent Cooke, they already knew of George Allen. He was the hot item on the coaching market at the time. They reeled him in quickly. I mean, there were some other teams that were interested in him, such as I believe the Eagles were interested in him too, and a few other teams. But he quickly became the Redskins head coach. That was just a few days after he was fired by Reeves for the second time. But that first season, when Allen coached the Redskins, the Senators moved out of Washington. That's when they became the Texas Rangers. There was no professional basketball team in Washington at the time. The Bullets didn't move to Washington from Baltimore until the 73-74 season. And the Washington Capitals, the hockey team, didn't start playing until 74. So the town was entirely Redskins. And it was like the awakening of a sleeping giant, because the Redskins had been, very entertaining on offense in the 60s, but they were still a mediocre to bad team. But Allen, he had those great offensive players. that he inherited from that team. But then he got great defensive players as well through his trading ways. Got the Ramskins, and they finished 9-4-1 in 1971. His first year coaching the Redskins. They lost in the first round of the playoffs to the 49ers. But the following year, he took them to Super Bowl VII, and they lost to the Miami Dolphins that year, 14-7. That was the Dolphins team that finished 17-0. But that was Allen's best Redskins team. After that, they went to 3 more playoff appearances and losing in the first round each time. But that's his Redskins. Season totals in a nutshell.
Yeah, do you think that his coaching and his years there were what allowed guys like, Chris Hamburger and Charlie Taylor and some of those guys? Do you think those allowed those guys to eventually don their gold jackets later on in their careers, or do you think that they were established before? Do you think he helped mold those guys into better players during his time there?
I don't think so. I think what Charlie Taylor was already an amazing player. I mean, he had been converted. He was originally a running back. He was NFL Rookie of the Year in 1964, but he was converted to a wide receiver in 1966, and he continued his. He was a superstar at that position as well. 1 year, 1967, Sonny Jurgensen finished number 1 in the league in passing. Taylor was number 1 in catches. Jerry Smith was number 2, great tight end, Jerry Smith. And Bobby Mitchell was number 4. So just imagine that talent, that level of talent on the Redskins offense at the time. They just had no defense. I mean, Hamburger was a great defensive player. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Hamburger, Brig Owens was on that Redskins team, another really good defensive player. But Hamburger was already established as one of the best linebackers in the game at that point, and he had already made a name for himself as the Hammer too. I mean, he had this way of tackling where he would take his forearm and just clobber a ball carrier around the neck. That was Chris Hamburger, the Hammer, which was allowable at the time. But yeah. So in answer to your question, those are 2 great players already when Allen came to Washington in 1971. But what he did is he fortified the defense. I mean, he acquired all these great players that he had in Los Angeles, who later became known as the Ramskins. He got Dyron Talbert, great defensive tackle. Myra Patios, he had a few good seasons left in him. He had Maxie Baughan, too, who had been an All-Pro previously, but he barely played in Washington. Boyd Dowler, he gave the Redskins another pretty good season in 1971. Rosie Taylor, he got him, too. Roosevelt Taylor was a player that Allen had acquired as the Bears' head talent scout. He got Rosie Taylor in 1961 as a free agent out of Grambling. Rosie Taylor had a league-tying 9 interceptions in 63, the Bears championship season, which Allen was the architect of that Bears great defense. And then Allen got him to play in 1972, his final season in the NFL. So he molded the defense to a really good squad. These players, they were aging, but they had some mileage left in him, and he was able to get the most out of them in 1972. The team plateaued after that. He never reached that level again. And I would also say that, in my opinion, his 1967 team, coaching the Rams, was his best team in the NFL. That 11-1-2 team that lost in the first round of the playoffs to the Packers. But that was just a great team. I mean, the Baltimore Colts also finished 11-1-2 that season and didn't even go to the playoffs. To give you a snapshot of the level of competition that existed back in that day.
It's really hard for me to picture Chris Hamburger as being that type of person. All the times I've talked to him at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, he's this soft-spoken older gentleman who seems like he's more likely to give you like a Werther's, caramel than anything else. He's not the Hammer that he once was. He's very soft-spoken now and kind of quiet and reserved to himself. So that's interesting. I hadn't heard that tackling style of him before.
Well, I'll just expound on that a little bit. I think that's one reason it may have taken him quite a long time to get into the Hall of Fame. He wasn't flamboyant in any way, outspoken. He never talked to the press. Okay, so the reporters really didn't get a chance to know him. So what you're saying is kind of in line with his personality. That's the way a lot. This is just real, this gentle, guy. I mean, I wouldn't call him a gentle giant. He was very small for a linebacker, but that's who Chris Hamburger was. Actually, is one of his nicknames when he played for Allen was Charles Bronson because of his hairstyle.
He does, yeah, and he kind of looks like him too. Mike Richman, our guest, by the way, he is a football historian and the author of George Allen: A Football Life, and it's about the coach George Allen, and there's another piece of it too that we'll get into later. But I think George has something he wanted to ask you here.
Yeah, obviously George Allen was known for his affinity for veterans, and you got into that a little bit. And I felt that sort of came full flower with him during his time with the Redskins. You've already mentioned some. I also think of Billy Kilmer and some others that were able to sort of blossom in the later years of their career with him. Because can you go into, we know he had the love for him. Why was that love with the veterans so much with him, and why did he pursue veterans over maybe a younger player?
It's a very interesting point that I elaborated on in the book, because as the head talent scout of the Bears, he had a very keen eye for great college talent. I mean, he drafted Ditka in 1961. He drafted Butkus and Sayers in 63. Now, you may say, well, those guys, that's a no-brainer. I mean, anybody could have drafted them. But still, I mean, not every top 5 pick is a home run. I mean, but those guys are in the Hall of Fame today. He led the drafting of Ronnie Bull, NFL Rookie of the Year, I believe, in 1962. At that time, I think he rushed for only more than 400 yards, but still, he was Rookie of the Year. There were other great young players he had in that 65 draft. The point I'm getting at is he switched his approach, his thinking, when he became a head coach in the NFL. He turned more toward the veterans, and he did a lot of that with the Rams. I mean, he made like 50-some trades, orchestrated those trades while he was with the Rams, and then he was even more fanatical about it when he was with the Redskins. But in fact, I asked Bruce Allen, his son, that question. Bruce was a ball boy for the Rams when his father coached there, and then later ball boy a couple of years with the Redskins. So, and he had a lot of insight into both eras in his father's life. I asked him that question. I said, why that great eye for young talent as with the Bears, and then focusing on veterans as a head coach? And Bruce explained it that by the time his father became a head coach in the NFL in 1966, things were starting to evolve a little bit in terms of more pressure on the head coaches to win. I wouldn't say it was the immediacy that exists today. I mean, could be like one season and you're out, or 2 seasons and you're out today. But the pressure existed there. I mean, the television contracts were building. They were becoming much more lucrative. So the money was starting to become more noticeable in the league. So I think the coaches felt it more at the time, and certainly Allen did. He felt that urgency to win right away, and he thought he could do it with veterans. But like one veteran he acquired with the Rams, Lee must have touched on this, was Roger Brown, who Allen basically had in his Rolodex. He got him right away when Rosa Greer went down with an injury. But then he really, he took that to a new dimension in with the Redskins. He made so many more trades for veterans. And with the Redskins, he had total control of the player roster as well as the draft. With the Rams, he just had control of the roster. Dan Reeves, the owner, had control of the draft. But Allen was everything with the Redskins. He was the general manager and coach and controlled everything. So that's actually one of the reasons that Edward Bennett Williams didn't like him, came to really loathe the fact that Allen was spending so much money on veteran players, and it really led to a lot of the antagonism that the two held for one another. But Allen did. And also another point I want to make is, and you alluded to this, George, he resuscitated the careers of a few veteran players, such as Billy Kilmer. Kilmer was basically, you would say, he was near the end of his career with the Saints. He played in the NFL for 10 seasons by the end of the 1970 season. But Allen resuscitated his career. He gave him a new opportunity in Washington. Allen and Kilmer, his luck. I mean, Jurgensen suffered that injury in the 71 preseason. Jurgensen was going to be the starter all the way. Allen was very excited to have him as a starting quarterback, but he went down with an injury in the 71 preseason. Immediately, Kilmer stepped in as the starting quarterback and actually started most of the time in Allen's first 4 seasons coaching the Redskins, 71 through 74, and then while Kilmer and Jurgensen were together. But another player, Ron McDowell, I mean, he was on the outs with the Bills owner, but was a Roush. Those two didn't see eye to eye. So McDowell wanted out from Buffalo. Roy Jefferson didn't like Carroll Rosenblum in Baltimore, even though Roy Jefferson had just earned a Super Bowl ring, Super Bowl V. He wanted out from Baltimore. So Allen resuscitated his career in Washington. And Jefferson, I mean, Kilmer was Allen's best acquisition, in my opinion, in that 71 season. But Jefferson, it was so clutch because Charlie Taylor suffered a season-ending injury in the 6th game of the season against the Chiefs. So Jefferson stepped in, had an amazing season. He went to the Pro Bowl in 71. So Allen just had this eye for veteran talent. I mean, he knew these guys had a few more good years left in them, and they really, in turn, they loved him for it. Not all of the existing players appreciated him, but the players that he acquired, Jack Pardee being another guy. I mean, he had been in the league since 56, 57. Allen acquired him as one of the Ramskins. He gave Allen 2 more years in Washington, 71, 72. He was a great play caller on defense, and he was the captain of the defense and led that Redskins defense that was the real highlight of that team in the 72 season, that Super Bowl season. So I hope that answered your question in terms of his focus on veterans.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and I was reading here the forward that we got by Dick Vermeil. That's something I want to focus on, Mike, but just reading a couple of quotes by him and saying how he
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. There's a static with the microphone.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Mike? No.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me. What I was saying is that I was reading some of the forward here and some of the quotes by Dick Vermeil, which is really cool that you got Coach Vermeil to do your forward for the book. But he had a large impact on a lot of the decisions that the Coach Vermeil made, like he said, going after a Willie Roaf later in his career coaching and going after a Claude Humphrey. And the 2 quotes that really struck me here that he said that George Allen would always say were, losing is worse than dying. You have to get up the next morning and face it all over again. And playing like we did today, we should donate all our checks to charity. I think those are just 2 fantastic quotes, but his style was really, really unique, and it had an impact on Dick Vermeil. And it makes me wonder now, too, part of the reason why Kurt Warner's career was the way it was is because, I don't know, maybe Dick Vermeil was reminded of the George Allen way of bringing these over-the-hill guys in. I mean, he really did he shape what a lot of the modern NFL is now because of that, with teams starting the year and saying, you know what, let's go find a couple of good veterans. Was he one of the first to really do that?
Well, I think he does have his fingerprints on the league today because of that. But I think where his legacy really stands out more is he introduced schemes on defense that are still used today. The 5 and 6 defensive backs, the nickel and dime defenses, respectively. Those are still part of the fabric of today's game. And he made special teams special. Vermeil, being a perfect example, he hired Vermeil as one of the first special teams coaches in the NFL in 1969. The same year, the Eagles hired Marv Levy. So Vermeil and Levy were the first 2 true special teams coaches in the NFL. But Allen also, he put more emphasis on special teams than all of his NFL coaching peers did. I mean, he would count on those special teams for at least 2 wins per season through a block kick or, a great kick return. And in fact, on a Monday night game in 1970, or it was in the 70s, he wanted the special teams introduced first. And it angered Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner. He said, no, you can't do that. But yeah, he wanted special teams introduced first. He wanted them to believe that they were an integral part of the game. And he would tell a lot of those special teams players, Bill Malinchek, great Redskins punt blocker, early mid-70s, and Rusty Tillman, one of the great coverage guys on the Redskins, kick coverage guys. They both told me, hey, Allen would approach us in the locker room before the game. He would say, this game rests on your shoulders. And it's actually one of the reasons Allen is one of the greatest motivational coaches in NFL history. NFL Films did in one of its top 10, they named him the number 5 greatest motivational coach in NFL history. So Yeah, he's in answer to your question, that those are other parts of, other areas where he definitely made an impact on the game today.
Well, and I think that's really unique to hear that, because covering different NFL games just about every other weekend and going to the locker rooms, the one thing I always feel looking at locker rooms now is that the special teams guys don't seem to be a part of the rest of the roster. Like their lockers are all right next to each other. And I don't know what coaches say to them before and after the games, but it never seems like the rest of the team talks with the kickers or talks with the punters as much. And that's cool to hear that he spent that time to go and tell them that, because I can't tell you how many times I've seen a team lose a game because of poor punting, or because a guy missed a kick at the end, or because the snap was bad. I mean, I think every one of us has a story about that with our favorite NFL teams. So of course it's important. Of course they're, one of the three phases of the game. It's crazy to think there were coaches before him that didn't feel that way.
Right. Well, I just want to also, in turning to modern times, I mean, Sunday's game between the Eagles and Bills, I mean, that game, this flashed before me, the blocked field goal and the missed field goal by the Bills. That basically decided that game when you count up all the points, okay? That decided that game, those two missed field goals. I mean, that I just thought of George Allen when that happened, his emphasis on special teams and how important they are, the block kicks and also the missed field goal, which I think was pretty much a chip shot. Maybe it's been like a 40-yard field goal or something, although it was a driving rain. But anyway, that's an example of how special teams can decide a game for good and bad.
I wanted to go into something. This is sort of on the periphery with him, but and I know there's a famous story involved, but he had a relationship with President Nixon, and I wanted you to go into that, because I guess one thing that struck me is, and we talked to Lee about this, and I know you also talk about in your book, is Allen was known as was hardly a fiscal conservative. I mean, he liked to spend money. And then I see this relationship with Richard Nixon. I know they both had ties with Whittier and everything else, but I guess a twofold question. I like you to go into the Nixon story and the play call and everything, but I also was curious, was Allen a political conservative? I was curious about that too. So I sort of a twofold question.
Sure. To the second part, I did ask his son, George Felix Allen, who, former politician himself, U.S. Senator and Governor of Virginia. The way he explained it, his father was basically apolitical. He wasn't. The only time he ever campaigned for somebody was for Ronald Reagan, another friend of his. He was on a campaign trip for him in 1980, but otherwise he never really got involved in politics to a large extent. There was a situation in 1972 when Nixon was running for his second term, where Allen was one of several NFL coaches and players who signed a poster for Nixon's reelection. But he never was out on the campaign trail for Nixon in any way. But they were friends. I mean, and like you said, they first met when Allen coached at Whittier, and they came in contact at an NCAA banquet in the early 50s. And Nixon wanted to meet this guy who was the head coach at Whittier, because that was Nixon's alma mater. So that's how they first came in contact, and they were talking X's and O's. And Nixon was actually a very intelligent guy in terms of sports, and particularly football. This guy had an encyclopedic memory when it came to football. And but they kept in touch over the years, and and actually, speaking of politics, so I will touch on this, and this is in the book. When Nixon called for the bombing of Cambodia in 1969 or 70, Allen wrote him a letter saying, because there were a lot of Democrats in Congress and also the media that were criticizing Nixon for doing that. So there was a letter that I uncovered in the archives at the Hall of Fame where Allen said, Mr. President, don't worry about what all the critics are saying. You do what you think is best. And it was in reference to his bombing of Cambodia. But anyway, when Allen became the coach in 1971 of the Redskins, and Nixon was in his third year in the White House, that's where they intersected in Washington, which really, a lot of people think that's where they first met, but that's not true, of course. In terms of the play, the Reds in the 1971 season, the Redskins were struggling a little bit. In a 3-game stretch around midseason, they had a tie and 2 losses. So Nixon contacted the Redskins and said, is it okay if I come out and give the team a pep talk? I want to come out to Redskins Park, which was then in Chantilly, Virginia, and that was actually Allen's brainchild. He had called for the building of Redskins Park, which was a state-of-the-art facility at the time. So sure enough, Nixon came out. It was several days before Thanksgiving in 1971. He had his entourage, Secret Service people. All of the White House press corps was there. They all streamed onto the practice field. The players didn't know what was going on. They hadn't been tipped off that the president was going to be there. But while he was there, and this is a story that actually Marv Levy shared with me, Allen tipped him off on a play. He said, one of the plays I'd like you to call here in practice is an end around to Roy Jefferson. And there was also a fullback screen that Allen called in that practice. It was like a little, he was there for about an hour and a half. He called a few plays in the practice there, and the Redskins ran them. So later that season, about, I would say, in the days leading up to the playoff game against the 49ers, Nixon called to Redskins Park. He got Allen on the phone, and then he got Billy Kilmer. And he said to both guys, he said, listen, I would really like to see an end around to Roy Jefferson in the playoff game. When the game actually rolled around, though, it was late in the first half. The Redskins had like a 1st and 10 around the 49ers 12-yard line. That play was called. And it was really unusual for an Allen coach team to call such a risky play, or trickery at that point when they're so close to the goal line, with his conservative style of play calling. But sure enough, that play was called, and Jefferson was dropped for a 10-yard loss by a guy named Cedric Hardman, 49ers defensive end. The Redskins didn't score a touchdown. They were up 10-3 at that time. They didn't score a touchdown, and the snap on the field goal was low, so they weren't able to attempt the field goal. So speaking of the importance of special teams, they didn't score any points at the end of the first half, and they went into halftime 10-3, demoralized. The other point I want to make about that play, though, is that, and I spoke to Billy Kilmer about it, he believes that play was called by Ted Marchibroda. Yeah, Nixon had asked for the play several days prior to the game, but actually when the play was called, it was Ted Marchibroda, the Redskins offensive coordinator, sending it in from the sidelines.
Got it. Interesting.
Okay, that's how that whole thing evolved.
What I want to know is what would have been the worst blunder to fans in D.C., that play call by Nixon or Watergate? What would they have disliked more? Was it the play call probably?
Well, that's a good question. I think they got there with Nixon's resignation. The press got what they wanted, and a lot of the people in D.C. got what they wanted. And actually, Nixon, I think it was inevitable he would have been impeached. But his resignation is what a lot of in the media wanted, and a lot of the Redskins fans wanted. In terms of the play, I'll say it's talked about to this day in the Washington area by people who remember that whole sequence. And in fact, I've gotten that question a number of times in interviews about my George Allen book. How did that whole play evolve? And because people from back then, they do remember. They remember Nixon called a play, but they don't remember these. They don't really know the inside story, the exact sequence about how that play was called. But I don't think Redskins fans are. Back then, they were angry over it, or they were, frustrated over the way Jefferson was dropped for a 10-yard loss, and they were pushed out of, touchdown range or whatever. But today, it's more of a matter of curiosity about that play. The fact that the belief is that Nixon called the play during the game, or he maybe even phoned it in from the Oval Office or something like that.
I can appreciate the fact that people still think about that play because, of course, here in Cleveland, we forget plays all the time. The drive, the fumble, the shot. We don't belabor those things. But hey, I lost my train of thought because I was talking about the drive, the shot, and the fumble.
Too much baggage that he brought up.
Too much baggage I brought up.
I did ask Ernest Biner a while back about that fumble, by the way.
So. Did you? Yeah, that's right. Because he ended up with Washington. Yeah. Right. So, Go ahead, John.
Mike, I did want to ask you about being able to get Coach Vermeil to write the foreword for this. I mean, I know a lot of other authors that have gotten great folks to write a foreword to it. In Lee's case, he did a tribute to his father at the beginning of his book. But what was that like, your conversations with Coach Vermeil and him deciding to do that for you? And how cool was that to have that moment with him?
Well, it was amazing that a man of his stature would agree to do it. And of course, I knew of his involvement with George Allen being the special teams coach. It really, when thinking back, it could have been either Vermeil or Marv Levy. Vermeil was a special teams coach for 1 year in LA. Levy was a special teams coach for 2 years in Washington. Both are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Both are well deserving of that honor. But Dick Vermeil was he was receptive to it right away. I mean, he really admired George Allen so much over the years, as you mentioned in reading part of the forward. There are several things that he has derived from Allen, things that he implemented as a coach himself over the years. So he had so much admiration for him. He knew of the family too. I believe he was in touch with Etty Allen, George Allen's wife, over the years. He really admired her. And so yeah, he was very receptive to it. But it was very cool to get a man of his standing to write the forward. And I've gotten very similar questions from people about that. Why Dick Vermeil, and how great was that you were able to get him to write the forward? So yeah, but it could have either been Vermeil or Marv Levy, and like I said, both were well deserving of that honor.
Mike, I got back my train of thought. One last question. You've written a book about George Allen. You also wrote the book about Joe Gibbs. Can you compare and contrast the two?
I think the greatest comparison between the two is that both were very industrious men. I mean, they both slept in their offices at Redskins Park. Allen, of course, was the first one to do that here in Washington that I know of, and then Gibbs took the mantle in the 80s. But their coaching philosophy was entirely different in terms. Gibbs was a offensive oriented coach, and Allen was primarily defense. So in that respect, they had two different visions of the game and what they should concentrate on as coaches. But and they had their own ways with players too. Allen was much more of a rah-rah type of coach. Like you guys alluded to before, he would have a way of pumping those players up with his enthusiasm. Gibbs, not so much. I think Gibbs did it more out of respect. The fact when he started winning, the players really, this probably happens with most, if not all coaches, but the players really started gravitating to him. They gained this just tremendous respect for Joe Gibbs and who he was. But he was just such he was a genius when it came to offense. He didn't invent the single back offense, the two tight end single back offense. I believe he learned that from Coryell, but he took that to a new level in Washington. And he got so fortunate with Riggins. Joe Washington got hurt in the 82 preseason. Riggins took over as the single back that year, and then really stepped forward in the 82 playoffs. And the rest is history. But yeah, they had two different philosophies on what they should concentrate on as coaches, but their workaholic nature was very similar. They knew they could make good decisions at halftime. If the team was struggling or whatever, but they could make good decisions at halftime to engineer that second half comeback because they had done so much homework on their respective teams.
Mike Richman, pro football historian, as well as an author of the book that we're speaking about right now, which is George Allen, A Football Life. It is Mike Richman, the author, and forward by Dick Vermeil. Mike, if people would like to purchase the book, maybe a Washington fan wants to get it for someone as a Christmas gift, or maybe they just want to learn more about the great history of the great coach, where can they do that?
Sure. Well, thank you for asking, John. It's available through traditional means, Amazon being one site where anybody can get it. If you want an author autographed copy, though, go to my website, MikeRichmanJournalist.com, and Richman is Richman, MikeRichmanJournalist.com for an author autographed personalized copy. So, and I'd be happy to put my John Hancock on it for anyone who asks.
Rich, Mike Richman, we appreciate you joining us and being part of the podcast tonight, and look forward to the next time that we get to chat about history about the team that plays in DC. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, John and George. I appreciate it, and I loved your questions.
Absolutely, and happy holidays to you as well.
Thank you. All the best to you.
Hello, sports fans. This is Mark Mortier from Yesterday's Sports on the Sports History Network. I just wanted to thank everyone who has listened to my podcasts and read my articles during the year of 2023. I wish you all a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, or whatever holiday you may be celebrating, and for a joyful New Year. Thank you once again.
This is Hunter Aronson of the Total Sports Recall Podcast, a part of the Sports History Network. We here at Sports History Network want to wish everyone a wonderful holiday season and extend our gratitude for your support of the Sports History Network. Happy holidays to all.
Hi, my friends of sports history. This is Darren Hayes of the Pigskin Dispatch and Jersey Dispatch podcast. I want to thank you for supporting the Sports History Network and all of us podcasters here, along with our podcasts and our other works, such as our websites and books, especially my podcast, the Pigskin Dispatch podcast, Jersey Dispatch podcast, and the Orville Mulligan Sports Writer podcast that I helped co-create and produce with Oz Davis. Also, thanks a lot for supporting my book, The World's Greatest Pro Gridiron Team, the 1903 Franklin All-Stars. And remember the reason for the season coming up here at the holidays, and spend time with your family and friends and enjoy each other. Have a Merry Christmas and a blessed New Year.